we can get started. Are pleased to have with us today Dr. Rebekah Paci-Green, who's been a faculty member here at Huxley College since 2007. She received her PhD from Cornell University, combining studies about structural engineering and anthropology to look at physical and social vulnerability and perceptions of risk in communities in Turkey. She's also done work in India and parts of Central Asia, and she's here to talk today about the work she's done in Nepal following the major earthquake there just a few years ago.
So thanks for inviting me. I do want to talk about some research that I finished up in Nepal this last summer. And it's about a really innovative approach to community development and risk reduction, especially in the school sector. And this was the first time globally that anyone has been able to really test whether this approach to community development and disaster risk reduction actually worked, because lots of these programs are happening around the world, but very rarely do they happen before a disaster and allow us to actually go in after the fact and go, well, okay, was that effective?
So just to give you a brief outline, I'm going to introduce the earthquake they experienced and educate.
Describe the methodology we used last summer to do our assessment post-earthquake and some of the findings. This is part of sort of a very broad research agenda, and I'll just hit some of the highlights in terms of differential school damage, knowledge change, and application in communities. And then I'll briefly touch on policy implications, although I could go on and on and on and on about that for hours, but I'll let you ask questions if that's of interest. So Nepal. Nepal is one of the world's natural hazard risk hotspots. It's a location where 97% of the population lives exposed to 2 or more natural hazards at the highest level of exposure. Pretty much everybody is experiencing earthquake risk, landslide risk, floods, and related monsoon risks everywhere across the country. This is a really hard situation to be in as a developing country, and they experience very regular and very large events. However, last year was particularly bad. They experienced the largest disaster of their history. It was a magnitude 7.8 earthquake that happened exactly a year ago next Monday. This earthquakes often we think about them as having an epicenter and having a single moment in time that they happen. That's not often true. Geologically, it's usually a series of events, and that's definitely what happened here. It started on in the western region of the country, in the Gorkha district, with this 7.8 event, and then it was followed by 120 aftershocks over a period of about a month in very short succession, sort of bookended on the other end by another aftershock that everyone else in the world would consider an earthquake. But because it was in this series, it was a 7.3 magnitude event, just an aftershock, and it was over in the Gorkha district. Both of these sort of sandwiched the Kathmandu Valley, which is where the largest population is. Altogether, about a third of the country's population was directly impacted, and there were 14 districts that were sort of in crisis impact. Over 500,000 houses were destroyed in this event. The loss was particularly acute in rural areas, many of which are very difficult to access prior to the earthquake, but because of earthquake-induced landslides after the event, they became even more difficult to access. There were nearly 9,000 casualties, which was actually a godsend. That was much lower than predicted because the event happened at 11:59 a.m. on a Saturday. It's the only day a week that children in Nepal are not in school. And it was in the spring when many family members were out working the rice paddy fields. That said, like in most natural hazard disasters, the impact was not uniform across the population. Death rates were highest among women and girls. And that's not surprising given the gendered nature of work in Nepal. Many of the girls and women were indoors doing chores, cleaning up the house and preparing meals, the noonday meal. And so they were trapped in collapsing buildings. All told, the estimated damage was $7 billion, which is about a third of the annual GDP of the country. Very, very large-scale event. So, it was a major natural hazard-induced disaster. I am fascinated with natural hazards and their social implications, but it's not because these events are surprising or sensational or particularly interesting in and of themselves. If anything, they're incredibly predictable. They're fairly routine when looked at on geological, hydrological, and meteorological scales. What fascinates me mostly about these events is that the impacts and the social implications are so widely varying. An event like this in one society can cause a regional emergency, but a fairly swift recovery. That same event of the same magnitude in a different society can cause widespread and sort of catastrophic destruction that leads to a degrading of community function and well-being for the society. So when I think about disasters, I don't think about the hazard event themselves, but I think about them as sort of these visceral and visual outcomes of a whole series of socio-cultural, economic, and historical processes of how a society and societies around that society pressure that society into shaping the way they live with their environment. And in particular, I find these events useful to study because differential impacts are often highest among marginalized groups. This is an environmental justice issue. And disasters can help us see hidden inequities in our routine decisions about planning and policy and community development. And by understanding what's happening in a disaster, sometimes we can see what we need to do and what we need to change about our routine community decision-making processes. That said, disasters affect everything. And you can't just study disasters writ large. It would be overwhelming. I have focused for the last decade or so on schools, and there's several reasons I focus on schools. Firstly, children are a vulnerable population. They are young, they are dependent, they are often physically weak because they are small. And so they depend on adults, whether that be their parents, their school, staff, or their community to make decisions about risk and about the safety of the structures that they are in, including their schools. Additionally, schools are one of the few places in society where attendance is compulsory. In Nepal, that is from pre-K up through 8th grade. Students are required to be in schools whether or not the building is safe. And the only thing that's comparable in society is really jails and courtrooms. Everything else, we kind of get to decide, and we can choose where we want to be. And we can make decisions based on risk. Children cannot do that. The other reason I focus on schools is because it's an extremely large expenditure in most national budgets. In Nepal, focus on the education sector takes up 15% of the national budget, and it's the largest expenditure in that national budget, and certainly the expenditure with the largest sort of a footprint and population served other than roadways. And it's really expensive to build schools the first time, and it's exponentially expensive if you have to build them after each disaster. We need to get to the point where we're not rebuilding after each of these events. I also see a lot of ecological implications for schools because it's such a resource-intensive expenditure. There's a lot of material resources that go into building schools. You don't want to do it more than once if you don't have to. And schools, surprisingly, are one of the sites where we can have the most effect in terms of population growth and population stabilization. One of the biggest predictors of reduction in in fertility rates is in low-income countries when you give access to girls, education to girls, and you give them educational parity, and you give them education over the long term, not just the first 3 years of education, but the first 8 to 12 years of education. That has a remarkable effect on reducing the population growth in these countries. So it's an important area for that as well. And just so you have a sense of that picture, yeah, obviously you can see some school damage there from the earthquake. It's probably worse than you think, because this building in the background is actually 4 stories tall. That prior to the earthquake, after the earthquake, it's 3 stories tall, and the missing story is right there. It completely collapsed. Thank goodness it was Saturday. The risk in the education sector in Nepal was not something that was unnoticed. This had been something that had been studied and was a significant worry, both in country and outside of the country. Because this is a very young population demographically, 1/3 of Nepalese are of school age and are in these buildings. The Ministry of Education oversees 82,000 public school buildings. And the scary part is about 90% of those buildings are load-bearing masonry. And that's an engineering term that I don't expect most of you to have much sense of, other than those of you who have been in my classes. Those of you in my classes should obviously be shocked about that figure, because you know that those buildings in particular, whether they be brick or stone or adobe, are the buildings that collapse most readily and most catastrophically in earthquakes. They tend to collapse at the first sort of initial shaking, and they tend to collapse inward on occupants in ways that it's nearly impossible for occupants to safely exit or survive. A 2000 study in Nepal estimated that about half of the school structures needed to be strengthened to survive predicted earthquakes, and an additional 12,000 were so bad that there wasn't even a way to strengthen them. They just needed to be demolished and torn down. This is a fairly overwhelming risk portfolio. And most countries, especially most low-income countries with this level of risk exposure, tend to go sort of in a fatalistic direction. They just sort of totally ignore the problem, or say, we'll deal with it after it all falls down and we reconstruct, and they don't do anything about it ahead of time. Nepal was interesting in that they started actually doing something about the risk before the disaster happened. The leader in this work was the National Society for Earthquake Technology, called NSET, and in 2009, they put forth a goal of a safer school education sector by 2020, and they began piloting the idea of, let's try to go in and let's try to strengthen schools. And they started with 40 schools in the Kathmandu Valley, and they started with low-cost retrofitting technologies. Now, what was interesting about this is Nepal has exactly 0 engineering experimental laboratories to test out this technology. You can't try this out in a lab to see if it's going to work. The closest lab is down in India and quite busy, not interested in testing Nepal's techniques. So, and on top of that, the construction in Nepal is so varied and so inconsistent that even if you tried it out in a laboratory, you'd be trying one thing, and there's a million of these things, and they're all different. But they did their best guess estimate about what was going to work, and they developed this strategy where they would cover the masonry walls of schools with a rich mixture of concrete, and then they would put this wire mesh around it, and it was, it's better than duct tape and chewing gum, just barely. But they wrapped this wire around, they drilled some holes through the wall, they threaded these wires from the outside face to the inside face, and they wound up sort of sandwiching the outside and the inside with wire mesh and tying it all together and then putting a concrete plaster on top of it all. And by that, they were going to hold the school building together. They were doing it mostly on calculations and a good faith attempt at what they thought was going to work, but there wasn't really any guarantee until we saw what happened in an earthquake. They also tried out new earthquake construction techniques on new construction. And here's an example of that, where they added reinforced concrete stitches, is what these are called, on the corners, and then reinforced concrete sill and lintel bands around a school building when they were building it for the first time and building it new. And those bands work somewhat like rubber bands to hold the walls from collapsing outward or inward. What was unique about NSET's approach is they didn't just do this as a technical fix. They didn't go in just as engineers. They partnered with community organizers and community development specialists to create a whole package. And they did a school-based community outreach alongside their retrofitting or their new construction techniques. They started out with town hall meetings. Many communities did not believe that there was an earthquake risk. The last major earthquake was about 75 years ago, and so many people just didn't have a memory of it. So they started out just talking to communities about, we have this risk, this is what could potentially happen, and we have a moral responsibility to protect our children. Wasn't particularly convincing, so they moved to something called a shake table demonstration, which was super cool. So they go to a community and they talk to the local masons and they tell the local masons, hey, we want you to build one of your standard houses and we're going to give you little miniature building blocks, little bricks and a little cement, and you can build your own model of your house. And right next to it, we're going to build the same model, but we're going to add the earthquake resistant technologies, those sill and lintel bands and those stitches. They would then put that all on a table with some springs on it, and they would shake the table in a big, huge community sort of celebration and event. And much to the villagers' shock, the building that had been built by their local masons collapsed, and the ones built by the NSET engineers do not. Everyone's attention is fully grabbed at that point, and they're like, okay, apparently what we're doing is not going to work. Apparently a good idea, and they were willing even at that point to raise funds, which was important because NSET didn't have the funds to just retrofit schools. They needed community contributions. Once they had community contributions, they engaged the local masons and trained them how to do the earthquake-resistant technologies, both in classroom instruction, in model site instruction, and then as apprentices on the school construction sites. They then also invited community members and especially parents to come to the construction site during the various stages of the retrofit or the new construction to explain what was happening at the school site and allow the community to ask lots and lots of questions. Following the completion of the project, they then worked with the school administration to create school disaster management committees and with the students to create school safety clubs so that the students could begin to have their own voice about what they wanted, which was safe schools. Those early pilots were so exciting and appeared to be quite successful, and a lot of other organizations got on the bandwagon. In 2011, the Ministry of Education, through funding with the World Bank, began piloting a series of school retrofits in the Kathmandu Valley. They allocated funds for the retrofit of 260 schools, which was about 10% of the schools in the valley. So a pretty big pilot. They were followed up by a bunch of humanitarian organizations from Europe, from the United States, and from the UN, who took the concepts and started doing their own school retrofit funding and designing earthquake-resistant school structures and doing new construction using NSET's designs. That said, it wasn't enough, and much of the work, about half of that Ministry of Education pilot study was completed before the Gorkha earthquake, and even if it had all been completed, the need was so great that, as everyone had expected and feared, the impacts of the Gorkha earthquake on the education sector were pronounced. Over 8,000 public schools affected, 2/3 of those heavily damaged, which means you cannot repair them, you're going to have to demolish and rebuild, or fully damaged as in completely collapsed. The minute that event happened, it was Saturday morning, I got it on my phone from USGS that there had been an earthquake in Nepal. I saw the size of the event. I knew it was going to be big. I knew what kind of damage was going to be expected. And I called my colleagues, my Nepali colleagues, and together, it took a couple days before we could get a phone line into colleagues in Nepal. But we immediately called NSET and said, "Hi, we know you're going to be overwhelmed. You've got 20 years of work ahead of you now with this event. How can we help?" And we started a participatory action research project with them, where together with the NSET organization, we thought through what is the most pressing need at this time. And they said, really, we need you to come and figure out a few things that we can't figure out ourselves because we're overwhelmed and because nobody's going to believe us if we say it. We need somebody independent to answer a few questions. That first question was, did the low-cost school retrofit program work? There was indications that, phone calls into NSET that said that the schools seem to have done well, but that's not enough. That's just anecdotal. You have to compare it to a similar site at a similar location to really know if it had had an impact. So that was our first question. Our next question was, if these projects happen in communities, is there a heightened awareness in the community about disaster risk reduction techniques, especially as they are related to construction practices? And thirdly, NSET's approach to engaging with the community, it's slow and it's pretty resource intensive in terms of people working with communities. It was much slower process than the Ministries of Education's process, which was just to take the design, take some engineers, bring in some outside contractors, and just do a retrofit of the school. And so NSET wanted to know, was there any value in the approach that they had taken? Or would the money be better spent just doing technical retrofits and sort of setting aside that community engagement piece, especially now that we've got about 10,000 schools that need to be rebuilt. So Bishnu Pandey, myself, extracted ourselves as soon as we could from grading and graduation last spring and headed over to Nepal. We were joined by a former U.S. aid worker who had overseen disaster risk reduction programs funded by U.S. aid in Nepal. And we had an advisory group that oversaw what we were doing and helped direct what we were doing, including input from NSET. Although once we got to Nepal, we separated ourselves from NSET pretty explicitly so that we could do an independent evaluation. They eagerly wanted to send their engineers out into the field with us, and we said no, because we didn't want their engineering presence to influence what people said to us. So what we did is we approached this using a matched pair site comparison approach. We found locations where we could get 3 different sites in close proximity to each other. The first site was just a standard school. Nothing had happened, just Ministry of Education construction. In close proximity, we looked for a site that had had a technical intervention. That is, engineers come in, do a technical retrofit or new construction, no community engagement. And then a third treatment, or a second treatment, which was NSET's approach of technical intervention combined with community engagement. To find locations where that was all happening was actually really difficult. We first looked at the shake maps coming out of the Gorkha event. Specifically, we wanted areas with heavy shaking so that we could actually see a real effect. And so we looked at areas sort of in orange. This is severe shaking. The violent shaking shown in red. It would have been nice to get some sites in those locations, but we couldn't actually access the locations because of landslides. So we were able to find 4 locations where we could get all 3 of those sites in close proximity. 2 were in the Kathmandu Valley. Bhaktapur is a district, right, sort of almost a suburb of the capital. And then we chose sites up in North Kathmandu. And then outside the valley, we chose areas, the district of Rasua and Sinjapalchuk. Rasua was particularly challenging. We didn't know we were going to be able to go there. There's an active, the biggest landslide I've ever seen, active there. And everyone was really concerned about us being on the active landslide and didn't think that the road had actually been opened, but we called through and we eventually got a hold of the schools in that location, and they said they had just cleared the roads and they thought the roads would stay clear long enough for us to go in and out for a couple of days. We didn't actually camp inside the active landslide though. And it took like 5 minutes to drive across the landslide. It was scary. Okay, so what we did at each of those sites, we used a mixed method approach. The first thing we did was rapid visual assessment. This is a pretty standard engineering post-disaster reconnaissance toolkit that we used. We also did community damage transects to understand how the housing had been damaged so that we could compare school damage and housing damage in areas that we know had exactly identical shaking. We then did semi-structured interviews, 2 to 3 hours, some of it were longer, with the school management committee, discussing with them the construction history and disaster management practices and risk awareness. Followed that up with mason interviews. We tried to get the masons who had actually did the construction of the school, whether a retrofit or new construction. In some communities that was impossible because they didn't exist, or they had been external masons who had come in. But we talked with masons when we could about what they had done at the school, what earthquake-resistant techniques they had used, and what earthquake-resistant techniques, if any, they were using in the community. We also talked with parents about their involvement in the project and their risk perceptions. So let's look at findings. First of all, that first question, sort of the very basic, did it work? We have 12 sites, 4 districts, 3 different sites per district. The first of the 3 had no intervention. The second of the 3 had technical intervention, and the third had technical and community engagement. So looking at those first schools where there had been no intervention, damage rates were moderate to collapse. And I'll give you some case studies of some of these schools just so you understand what they look like. Here's a moderately damaged school that I'm going to call Jungle Stream. I don't use the actual names of any of the locations because we promised confidentiality to everyone who spoke with us. But this is an interesting case because it describes pretty succinctly how Nepalese communities build their schools. The principal, the school was actually a very small school at a different location, but they were overcrowded. There was about 50 students per very small classroom, and they needed to expand. The principal started raising funds. He found a charitable Japanese donor. He found a local utility who would sponsor him. He got some money from the local congressman and some money from the Ministry of Education. He hodgepodged all these funds together and got enough funds to start building a school. He had a local engineer in the community draw up a design. It was probably a decent design, but he looked at it. He hired a local mason who had never built large buildings before. They looked at the design and they decided they didn't really like it, so they made some modifications to the design. They decided, you know, I think we can skimp on materials here or there and we can get an extra floor out of this funding. So what had started out as an L-shaped two-story building winds up as a straight line three-story building built over time. Half of the building, this half of the building was funded by Ministry of Education, so they were very concerned about how it was built, and they sent out inspectors to look at the construction quality. The principal said, well, you know, we're planning to add an extra third floor, and the Ministry of Education engineer said, no, that's a really bad idea. Your foundation isn't strong enough. No, you cannot. But they had private funding for this side, and so they had no restrictions, and they added that third floor on the side that the Ministry of Education wasn't inspecting. After the earthquake, the damage was pretty significant to the walls. And while this isn't going to collapse on anyone immediately, in an aftershock, these walls have enough damage to them that they could easily fall and crush students and staff inside of them. So this building can no longer be used. It will have to be torn down. As a second case study, looking at in Sinjapalchuk, here was a collapsed school. And this is also a very typical construction pattern for rural and remote Nepal. This community wound up having a visitor from a northern European country come to the village and fall in love with the village, sort of adopt the village, and went back to his country and raised a whole bunch of money to build a school in this rural Sinjapalchuk village. They sent, it was about $20,000 to the village. The village had no local masons, but they took the money and they were like, schools, we can build schools, we build houses, we build our own houses, we can build our own schools. And in fact, with all this money that they got from this Northern European donor, they were really excited because they said, okay, well, we can build a really nice school, and in fact, we can use this really fancy new material that's coming out of Kathmandu, reinforced concrete. They'd never used it in their community at all, but they thought it was going to be cool. So they built a rubble stone two-story school. They put reinforced concrete floors on, which are very heavy. Never would have suggested that. And they were really proud of this school and devastated when it collapsed. Did not even fathom that that was a possibility because they thought with all the money they had spent and all of the new technology they had used, surely their school was going to have survived that. It did not. Looking at the schools where there had been a technical intervention, whether it had been a school retrofit or a new construction with earthquake-resistant designs. In the Kathmandu Valley, much better, no damage. Here's an example of that. And what's really insightful about this example, you'll notice there's a bunch of cracking here, right? And you're like, oh, that's not no damage. This block over here is the block that was retrofitted. But the Ministry of Education, which funded this one, didn't have enough funds to do both blocks. So they just did the block for the primary school, the preschool, which is housed here, and the administrative offices. They said, we don't have funds for that, so we won't do it. So this was sort of our perfect natural experiment where we have exactly the same construction, exactly the same site, exactly the same shaking, two different interventions, one no intervention and one a technical intervention. And happy to say there wasn't a crack, there wasn't any damage here. That building will continue to be used. That said, outside of Kathmandu Valley, the results were not nearly as positive with these technical interventions. Stony Steps School was particularly interesting. We got there, we had it on our list, and we knew, okay, here's a school where there's been a retrofit. We went down to the community and we looked around and we looked around, and there was no school that had been retrofitted. And we thought we had the wrong community. We started asking around, and they went, oh, yeah, there was. Here it is. We moved all the stones because it had completely collapsed. And they had cleaned the site before we got there. The principal, however, thankfully, had taken pictures on his smartphone and was able to give us images of what the school looked like right after the event. This site had been funded by, I can't give you the names, but it's a big one. It's a big international aid organization that had come into this community, convinced them that they could do a retrofit. They had spent 2 days training local masons and said, here's what you do. You drill some holes, you throw some wire up, you tie it all together, and then they left. The local masons tried, but anyone ever tried to drill through stone? Doesn't work, and the masons found that the plan that had been given to them wasn't very effective, so they kind of just made up what they were doing. The donor came back 2 or 3 times for inspection, kind of said, yeah, it's looking fine, looking great, and had a great big party to commemorate this rubble stone retrofit project that they had completed. They had it all up over their websites and were championing the work they were doing in safer school construction in Nepal until the Gorkha earthquake. And since that time, those pictures have been quietly removed from their website, and there is no mention of this site. The organization did not come back to the community at all. Okay, then we get to the third case where there had been technical intervention and community engagement. And here it's a kind of boring picture. They all did fine. Here's a site. This was adobe construction, which is one of the hardest things you can possibly retrofit. Fine, not a single crack. Here's a school outside of the valley. This was new construction using those lintel bands and stitches. Fine, not a crack. In fact, this was the only building in the entire community that was standing. And so they had converted it to temporary housing, and they had put up a tarp, and they were using this space when we got there for a tailor had set up shop, and there were a couple other people who had set up shop in that area because they'd lost their business locations. Okay, so that's answered our first question. Our second question, can these projects increase knowledge? Do you get a transfer? For this, I'm not going to go into the technical details, but we looked at 7 different techniques that can be used for stone construction or reinforced concrete construction based on worldwide consensus for non-engineered construction in earthquake zones, you know, the techniques that work well. And we asked masons and parents, sometimes principals, about these techniques, whether they were familiar with them and whether they were seeing them in their community. Looking at those first set where there was no intervention, sort of unsurprisingly, nobody knew about these techniques. This was the school that had gotten funds from the Northern Europeans. And they didn't have any masons to ask. Nobody knew anything because nobody had actually, there were no professional builders in the community. Looking at the schools where there had been technical interventions but not community engagement, a little better. There were some indications that people had at least some awareness about these technologies and even potentially limited use in construction. But what's interesting is the places where it was used the most, right here and here, this was not because of the school site. The masons who told us, yes, we are aware of these technologies, these were masons that had left Nepal and gone and worked for 10 years in Malaysia and Saudi Arabia as construction workers. And so they'd seen those techniques in those other countries, and they'd come back. They didn't understand what they were for. They had no idea that it had anything to do with earthquakes. But they were like, oh yeah, we've seen that. But that was sort of the extent of their knowledge of these techniques. And then moving to the schools where there was community engagement. It would be lovely and perfect results if that was all green and everybody knew about it, but that wasn't the case. It was somewhat spotty. They understood some of the techniques and they said that they were applying some of the techniques, but it wasn't uniform. But there was, you could see some level of penetration and certainly a better level of knowledge than in the communities that had not had that community engagement. So then the question is, does knowledge get you something better in terms of community level disaster risk reduction? If they have more knowledge about what to do right, are they actually applying it? And there's no really good way to answer this question. The only way I could really systematically have answered this question would be to tear down the buildings in the community and look at what had happened at each construction site, but you can't do that. So what we had to do is do a qualitative approach, and we talked with the masons and the parents and the principals. And one thing, I won't go into all the details, but one thing that came out really strongly was that the masons had wound up, especially in the Kathmandu Valley, being catalysts for community-wide change. Following the school retrofit projects, they had started training junior masons in the techniques. When they were asked to build new houses in their community, they started out with saying, hey, do you know that school retrofit project? We have a big earthquake risk. Do you want me to use those techniques here on your house? Some changes they were able to just institute straight up, such as vertical reinforcing and shear tie shape and bar bending. Those are no cost or very low cost changes, and they just, as professionals, said, we're going to build this way from here on out. Other more advanced techniques they advocated for with the homeowners, and this mason in particular was able to say he could get about 50% of the homeowners that built homes after the school retrofit project happened in the community to use one or more of these techniques, which is a pretty significant change. And even one of these changes has a significant reduction in the likelihood of building collapse. That said, outside the valley, the picture was much bleaker. The impacts were much more muted. And in fact, they seemed rather ephemeral. In both of the sites where NSET had worked, the school construction, the retrofit or the new construction, had gone through. That building had been undamaged, but the community hadn't kept with the process. In this upper site in Rasua, this lower story is the story that NSET built. After NSET left, the community raised additional funds to build a second floor. The NSET engineer had designed it for 2 floors, so it wasn't a particular problem that they put on an extra floor. But they used the techniques on this half of the building. And by the time they started building the second half of the building, they talked themselves out of using the earthquake-resistant techniques. And they were like, we could use the earthquake-resistant techniques, but it's a little more expensive, or we could save that money and we could pay ourselves, which is a form of corruption. And they chose the we're going to pay ourselves rather than use the techniques. In the lower site, which is in Sinjapalchuk, the school did very well, but 10 years later, when they needed to build a new school block for an expanding school population, the community had an all-out fight. The entire community sat in the schoolyard, and they debated how they were going to build the new school block. And there was a rift between community members who said, hey, we know how to build an earthquake-resistant masonry structure, let's do that. And another segment of the community that said, no, you know that really cool school over there that did the reinforced concrete? Let's do something like that. Let's build with reinforced concrete, because that's the cool construction material. And they saw it as an either or. They saw either we can have earthquake-resistant construction, or we can have new materials, reinforced concrete, and didn't see that you could actually have earthquake-safe reinforced concrete. The folks who wanted reinforced concrete won out. They built a reinforced concrete school. The walls were damaged moderately, and that building was not accessible after the earthquake. And they were, quite chagrined in the community and quite regretful of their decision afterwards. So in summary, there seems to be some comparative advantages to community-based technical interventions. Certainly, we had less damage to the school infrastructure. Certainly, where this was happening, communities could use that school building immediately afterwards. That's great. There seemed to be some increased knowledge of hazard protective action and some transfer to housing construction and a sort of a development of a culture of safety in the communities. That said, there's some remaining challenges, especially outside the Kathmandu Valley, in terms of developing techniques that are going to work for rubble stone construction, a very, very tricky thing to do. Also, trouble and new strategies needed for adequately training the masons and ensuring continuous oversight in these remote and often difficult to access locations. And then figuring out ways to extend the impact, not just to the construction of that one building, but over time and over space, and throughout, infusing that throughout the community. So in terms of policy recommendations, immediately after we got out of the field, we wrote up a summary of our findings, lots of fun photos, flashy, made it look very much like sort of the NGO world of big reports, and we shopped that around to the development banks, to UNICEF, Save the Children, Ministry of Education. We had a big presentation in Kathmandu and started a conversation about, okay, we've got a massive reconstruction process ahead of us. How are we going to do this reconstruction in a way that isn't just rebuilding vulnerability back into these communities? So I'm not going to talk about all of my policy recommendations, but one of them in particular is a public commitment to safer school construction. The way that countries and non-governmental organizations typically talk about development right now is the number of schools or classrooms built. And it's just, we built 10,000 classrooms in the last 5 years, hurrah. And we need to shift that to how many safe school buildings, how many safe classrooms did you build? Because if you just build schools that are going to collapse, you've abdicated moral responsibility, and you've created a situation where communities are expending incredible resources only to lose them in the next event. And then we are pushing very hard right now, especially with the development banks and the Ministry of Education. Well, the Ministry of Education is easy, but the hard part is convincing the banks that every school project needs to have a community engagement set aside. We're benchmarking that at 5%. So 5% of the budget of school reconstruction funds should be set aside for community engagement, including training of the local masons, providing training and checklists for parents, school committees, and the masons themselves, and creating a system of transparency. We're talking about, for instance, a phone app where parents can take a photo and say, I think they're supposed to be using vertical reinforcement, but click, I don't see it, and send that to the Ministry of Education to trigger more frequent and pointed reviews and oversight where necessary.
Well, let's thank Dr. Paci-Green for her